It was very quiet in Graybridge when it woke up on October 16th, 1903. It didn't feel like peace, but like someone wasn't there. In the night, the wind died down. It was strange that the train whistle that normally split the dawn in half like a ritual scream was late. This big Victorian house was on the end of town, where the hills fell away to the creek and the maple trees held on to their last bit of gold. There was no sound at all, no sounds, laughing, or steps from 6 young women starting their day. The Whitmoor family had hired Olive Keller as a maid almost 10 years ago. She showed up at exactly 6:45 a.m., as she had done every morning since the family became famous. She used her own key to open the back door and get inside. She was about to start the process of warming the stove and filling the scullery with the smell of biscuits and coffee. When she stepped outside, there was total silence that was so out of place that it made her stop in the doorway. The house was dead. Around this time every day, Clara, one of the Whitmoor girls, would be pacing the hallway above getting her teaching materials ready. Nora's hum would be coming from the sunroom, and the twins would be moving through the kitchen in sync as normal, talking about their dress shop appointments. It was Edith and Lillian's daily routine to tease each other, listen to music, and fix their hair right before school. Nothing came that morning. There was no sound, not even the creak of the wood floor. Olive spoke softly at first, then more loudly. The thin, shaky sound of her voice disappeared into the halls as if it had been eaten whole. She slowly climbed the main stairs out of fear. The hall on the second floor stretched out in front of her doors, which were all closed neatly, almost perfectly, on purpose. First, she tried Clara's door. It began with a whisper. Inside, in perfect order. The bed was made with exact geometry in mind. The nightgown is neatly hung on the hook. Lesson plans are set up, books are stacked, and the toothbrush is clean. Not a single strand is dirty. It looked like she had never slept in it. Olive went to the room of Nora next. Gasped. The artist, Nora, never left things this clean. The canvases were lined up exactly against the far wall. The brushes were clean and in order, and the paint tubes were all closed up. The room looked like a museum show that was set up for people who never showed up. Olive's hands were shaking by the time she got to Edith and Lillian's bedrooms in the attic. Their beds were cold, and their shoes were still not on. There were no signs of fighting or rushing to pack. Just nothing. Not girl. There was no message or goodbye. Half of the town was at the gates of Whitmoor Manor within an hour. She ran down the stairs, out the front door, and across Maple Street, yelling, "They're gone! They're all gone!" Sheriff Harland showed up, pale and short of breath. Dr. Emery did the same thing. Pastor Leland did too. He stood in the front yard with his hat in his hands, and tears starting to form behind his glasses. Then Tobias Whitmore showed up. He was the one who had built this house stone by stone with money that no one else had. Didn't know how he made money. 7 years ago, the man came to Graybridge with 6 girls, a wagon full of supplies, and a face that looked like it had been through too much winter. He just stood there and looked up at the windows of his house, which were empty. When someone asked him where his daughters were, he said in a whisper, "They were here last night, but none of them are now." That October, the town of Graybridge lost 6 daughters. No one ever saw them again, at least not in Graybridge. In the morning, one must first know who the Whitmoor girls were, not just by name but also in person. They weren't just admired. They were an important part of town life. Clara, who was 26 years old and the oldest, had a mind like Flint's and a voice that could calm a room without using force. The kids who used to be afraid of numbers and letters became curious and sure of themselves after she taught at the Graybridge schoolhouse. Her classroom always had a chalk and lilac smell, and her lesson plans were. very careful and full of questions instead of rules. While the kids were having trouble, she stayed late to help them. She also wrote letters to all of their parents and read books by lamplight after midnight. Some people said Clara could have gone to college if she had been born a boy. Nora, who was only 2 years old, lived in her hands more than in her head. The way mist formed at the corners of barns, the curve of a child's back, and the blue in the snow were some of the things she painted that other people missed. Her small studio behind the manor house was both a museum and a safe place for her to be. She talked. She didn't say much in public, but in her art, she told the truth about the land, women, and silence. All over Graybridge, her paintings were in houses and shops, and she was asked to draw at every wedding and christening. Beatrice and Bonnie, twins who were 22 years old, had the same looks but different personalities. Beatrice was fiery, opinionated, and smart, and she was always planning how to turn their small dress shop into a full-fledged atelier. Bonnie was gentle with water, alert, and the person who kept the book calmed down the clients and finished every hem in silence. They turned a small front parlor into the best dressmaking business in the neighborhood by working together. 4 neighborhood girls worked for them, and warm bread was always ready in the back room for customers who stayed to talk. You could buy more than just dresses there. It was there that Graybridge's women could speak up. Edith, 19, was born with singing in her blood. She was so graceful when she played the church organ that men of age forgot to sing. She had a voice that could melt ice, but what she really did was listen to the old, the poor, and the. She planned the winter drives and took food boxes to the mining camps. One time, she sat with a dying widow for 3 nights in a row so she wouldn't be alone. Edith always wished she could start a neighborhood choir, but she never did. She was the youngest at 15 years old. It wasn't her job or her title. She only had light. She knew what your dog's name was and read to little kids. Kids at the tiny Graybridge library brought the postmaster's wife slices of pie just because she looked like sunshine. A town drunk once said that Lillian sitting with him on the church steps and calling him Mister made him sober for a whole week. No one had called him that in years. The 6 sisters turned Whitmoor House into a lighthouse instead of a castle. They made it a warm and welcoming place with lots of light from the windows and music, books, and laughter filling the halls. Like spring water. All the mystery and fame that Tobias Whitmoor had, he was seen as a loving father. They got a payola and a garden from him. When Beatrice asked for Paris silk, he sent it away. People in Graybridge thought it looked like a storybook. That's why it didn't just break hearts when it broke. It broke something in the town's structure. Just because girls go away doesn't mean they don't exist. Not from a house that is locked from the inside. Not from beds that have never been slept in. Not all 6 at once. In the fall of 1903, Graybridge, Wyoming looked like a nice place to retire. Along the side of the hill, the train tracks shone like silver. There was a good curfew at the bar. The coal mine had the best pay. The Methodist church had new paint on the walls, and there was a public study room and a 2-room schoolhouse. People put their hats on. Rumors moved more slowly than the wind. In spite of how clean Graybridge looked, things were changing. The coming of. 7 years ago, the train broke through the town and made it very open. There are now more than 100 people living in what used to be a quiet mining town of less than 300. Yes, the trains brought opportunities, but they also brought competition and quiet anger. Investors from the east came in with new money and didn't tip their hats. They bought land and started development offices. No one really got it. They built big homes, brought strange machines, and had dinner parties that people in the area were jealous of. Never asked to. Some said it was the cost of making progress. Some people weren't sure. At the edges of the coal pits, labor conflicts grew. Men who used to share food secretly were now wary of each other, both those in and out of unions. What did the sheriff do? He was careful. The mayor didn't say much. And some girls who had grown up working behind store counters or taking lunch to the fields just vanished. For work, to get married, or to go to school, they went to Chicago, Portland, or back east. Their loved ones. Showed pride with a smile and a nod, but the letters slowed down and then stopped as the weeks turned into months and then years. One dad drank himself to sleep. Another mother didn't open or touch the girl's room at all. No one asked too many things. People in the town told each other that times had changed and that the girls were lucky to have gotten away. People did remember, though, especially the women. They remembered that the smartest, most beautiful girls were often the ones who were most helpful. They thought about that before each. There was one left. A man in a dark coat had been seen at the station or eating quietly at the Clifton Hotel. Many people knew that Tobias Whitmoor had started getting visitors like these around the middle of summer. Always guys in tailored coats, always coming in on the train at midnight and leaving before dawn. The widow Mrs. Langley, who lived across the street from Whitmoor Manor, said that from July to October she saw 6 different people. All of them were tall, quiet, and wore the same shined veil, which was way too classy for Graybridge's mud. But no one told anyone about them. Why would they? Tobias was a good person who was kind. He did his taxes, gave wood for the new schoolhouse roof, and paid for the harvest party. Still, people started to talk. Why did he let his girls dress so nicely every day? Why did Clara look like she was paying less attention in class? Why did the girls lock their sewing room when no one else had? What was the point of Nora painting over her fall picture 4 times? There was a movement, something was getting stronger. Graybridge didn't know how to say it. Only the weight of fear that isn't said. So, when the girls disappeared, there wasn't just fear in the air. Yes, it was praise. They knew it was going to happen. They hadn't said anything. The morning of October 15th, 1903, in Graybridge was like any other Thursday in the fall. The frost stuck to the window panes like lace. A thin, sleepy cloud of smoke rose from the stovepipes. Kids from school were chasing each other past the steps of the post office. A lot of coal carts shook through town, like a clock. At exactly 7 a.m., Tobias Whitmoor opened the doors to Whitmoor's market and stores. He always did it in the morning, rain or shine. At 7:50, Clara left the house. It was normal to do that. Her bag was on one arm, and her coat was buttoned up to her chin. Her hair was placed just so. She always stopped to talk to the Reverend's wife on the corner, but she didn't that morning. The Henderson boy who swept the school steps didn't get away from her. Her eyes were far away. Her step was cut short, stressed. By tender zeros, Nora had set up her easel in the garden behind the manor's backyard. From the other side of the street, Mrs. Langley watched while pretending to water her flowers. Nora painted with long, smooth lines that made it look like her brush was moving. But that morning, she stopped a lot, rubbed her forehead, and kept coming back to the same small piece of canvas. It looked like she kept painting the horizon, removing it and painting it again, as if she were trying to catch something that wouldn't stay still. Becky and Beatrice opened the dress shop at 10:30. The mayor's wife came in to get her hem fixed. Afterward, she told the sheriff that the girls whispered something important when no one else was around and stopped moving when she walked in. The board with the orders had been wiped clean. There are no new plans. There was a loose, closed sign behind the counter, ready to be flipped. Edith worked on her Sunday songs in the church hall, but Pastor Leland said she was unsure, missing notes, and losing her rhythm, which wasn't like her at all. In the middle of the line, the singer stops to look at the chapel doors. Someone asked her if she was sick, and she said, "I think we're leaving." But she wouldn't say what that meant. There wasn't much going on outside, not even Lillian, the happy child of sunshine. In the basement, she helped Mrs. Keller pack boxes. She asked, "Have you ever wanted to leave so badly that you could feel it in your teeth?" The maid asked, "Where would you go, sweet girl?" Lillian just replied, "I don't know." Somewhere with no trains. At 3:20 p.m. that same day, Dr. Charles Emery was coming back from a house call when he saw all 6 sisters heading down River Street toward the train station. He stopped right there. He later swore under oath, "I had never seen all of them outside the house together like that, not even on Sundays, and never without their dad." On this walk, they didn't talk, laugh, or smile at each other like they did before. Their faces were pale, with forward-looking eyes that looked like troops' eyes. Into a storm they couldn't get out of. That was the only time the youngest Lillian looked back. It was the first time her eyes met his that Dr. Emery said he would never forget what he saw. He said it was the kind of fear that sits behind the ribs. More than that, though, it was a plea. As the sun went down behind the hills, the girls were no longer visible. By the time the sun came up again, they were also gone. At the Whitmoor Manor, things were always being seen or heard. Mrs. Olive Keller had worked as a maid and kept secrets. It had been there long enough that they knew every creak in the floors, every grumble of the pipes, and every lock that needed to be oiled. She said that the sound of a daughter's steps could tell her which one was coming down the stairs. But the house didn't make any noise at all on the night of October 15th, 1903. According to what Tobias Whitmoor told Sheriff Harland, he went to his study at 9:45 p.m. As he always did, he looked over shipping bills and letters from Boston. He said that nothing strange happened. There was no sound or knock at the door. From the second floor. He said the house was quiet, but Olive would pick a different word later. She said he was dead. It didn't feel alive. By 10 o'clock, she was done with her work. She remembered the silence as clearly as ever. There was no soft piano music coming from upstairs, the sound of pages turning, or noises coming from behind closed doors. The air was thick and still, like the house wasn't letting out any air. Before she left, she did one last check of the kitchen. The things that are growing hadn't been touched. Not the normal signs. The girls shared a late-night snack before going to bed. There were no crumbs, cups, or laughs. Everything was ready. She turned off the light, locked the door, and walked out into the cold night. Later, she swore that door was still locked when she came back the next morning. Tobias said that at 11:30 he made his last rounds, checked the doors, said a quiet prayer in the library, where a picture of his wife was hanging, and then went to bed. He said no one woke him up during the night, but when asked by the police officer asked him why his bedroom lamp was still on at dawn, and he said he didn't remember leaving it on. That night, no one else came into the house. Not a single lock or window was forced open. Still, 6 young women were gone by morning. Clara's lesson plans were on her desk but not used. There was still half of a painting stuck in Nora's easel, which was facing the backyard. Their work aprons were nicely hung from the pegs. Edith's music was on the piano stand, and The Secret, Lillian's favorite book, was nearby. Garden. Her eyes were closed on her pillow, as if she had planned to finish the last chapter but changed her mind. The beds were chilly. The dresses were still hanging there. There were still shoe prints on the walls. They seemed to have just stepped out of their own lives. The house that carefully watched every day had nothing to say about the night they left. There were no tracks in the frost, doors that were open or goodbyes. There was only that impossible quiet. Sheriff Lane Harland had been in charge of Graybridge for more than 10 years. He had never been through anything like the morning of October 16th before. Olive Keller called him to Whitmoor Manor just after 7:30 a.m., and she met him at the front gate with her hands still shaking and her apron half-tied. He went inside and saw Tobias Whitmoor standing at the bottom of the grand staircase. He was pale and shocked, and he was whispering the names of his girls one by one, like a prayer that wouldn't take root. He went through the house slowly, carefully, and professionally. He was very upset by what he found. One thing was missing from each bedroom. The beds had not been slept in, the clothes had not been touched, and personal items were not where they should have been. It was clear that someone had looked through them, not to steal, but to look around. The drawers had been opened and then shut. Letters had been taken out of their envelopes and folded again. Jewelry boxes had their lids taken off and were probably looked at, but not touched. Everything was where it belonged. But every room heard the same thing. Someone wasn't here, but was. They were looking for a place to join and knew what they wanted. What most amazed Harlan was how everything fit together. With the same quiet care, each room was broken into. Not sacked or stolen, but looked over by someone who didn't really know these girls. The items were put back in the wrong order. Clara's lesson books were on the shelf backwards. Nora sorts her paints by color instead of what they are used for. Bonnie put her pincushion in the wrong drawer. Someone tried to hide their tracks, but they weren't aware of it. Know the girls well enough to do it right. Harlan asked Tobias a question right away. The man looked tired, not like a father who was sad, but like a man who was waiting for a punishment he already knew was coming. Tomas said they went to bed. At about 9:30, I kissed Lillian on the face myself. There was no sign of the girls taking off their clothes, but everything was fine. Their beds were way too good. The next day's clothes were all laid out, and there wasn't a wrinkle in sight. This was something they did every day with almost military precision. Beyond the house, there were no marks in the soft ground near the base of the building. There are no signs of wheels, horses, or boots. Even though it hadn't rained, the early frost would have kept any signs of movement clear. There wasn't anything. In the quiet tents by noon, a crowd had formed. No one dared to say out loud what they feared most, that the girls were not just missing, they had gone away. Harlan rode his bike to the train station that afternoon. Mr. Fletcher, the station master, said that no Whitmoor girls had bought tickets the night before. The train going east arrived at 10:12 p.m. and left again after 15 minutes. He did remember seeing something strange around 9:00 p.m. 6 beautiful young women in their best gowns stood in a line under the lamplight. He said they were just standing there like figures facing the tracks and not talking. What did Harlan then ask? Fletcher answered. I looked down to finish my ledger. They were gone when I looked up again. Graybridge had always been wary of people from other places. It used to be anyway, but good luck has a way to dull the senses of a town. Men in dark coats and nice shoes came to the valley with the train, which brought business and money. At first, people were glad to see them. They said that they were investors, land appraisers, and developers. It was a short stay at the Clifton Hotel and tea at the Rosewood Cafe. They didn't talk much and left quickly. No one asked too many things. Things went well. Once the Whitmoor girls were no longer seen, though, questions finally started to flow. The sheriff, Harland, and the minister, Leland, made a list of all the unknown people who came to Graybridge in the 4 months before October. At least 10 guys, all of whom came on the night train and left before breakfast, and all of whom visited the Whitmoor residence at some point. They didn't use their full names. Some were seen coming in through the back gate at night with thin leather veils or rolled papers, but they never stayed for more than a few hours. One neighbor, Mr. Josiah Banning, who lived right behind the Whitmoor, said that he saw Tobias lead one of these men out of the garden gate late at night in September. He thought back to the man in the coat. They didn't say a word to each other. He touched Tobias on the shoulder. Not nice at all. Last word. Harlan Moore was scared by what he saw at the telegraph office. From August to early October, more than 20 telegrams were sent from the Graybridge office using a code made up of letters and numbers. They were sent in a way that wasn't standard, and they weren't written in plain English. Dear Tobias Whitmoor, New York, Chicago, St. Louis, and San Francisco are the places they're going. Timothy, who worked at night, remembered the messages very well. He said, "They look like crap to me." But Mr. Whitmore always paid in cash and told me to wrap the wires myself. Short bursts of messages were often sent late at night, often after a visitor came into town the day before. It looked like Tobias was telling about someone or something. Someone had messed with the guest logs at the Clifton Hotel. Pages were torn and ink was smudged. The owner, Mr. Duvall, said it was a mistake made by a secretary. But behind the counter, a chambermaid named Ruthie quietly gave Sheriff Harlan a bunch of folded linen napkins with the letters UAC in gold on each one. She said they were in a room where one of the guests had stayed. She said in a whisper, "Left in a drawer." At the time, I didn't think much of it. UAC. But Reverend Leland, who had studied for a short time in Boston, looked at the letters with a pale face. No one else in town knew what it was. Union. He spoke about the Atlantic Consortium. The name of the business has been heard. Separate, old, and very old. They buy tools and land. Also people. I think that was the first time someone in Graybridge said it out loud. This might not have been a simple disappearance. It could have been a deal. Tony Whitmore had been the town's favorite mystery for a long time. No one was sure how he got so rich. It was winter 1896 when he got to Graybridge. All he had with him was a wagon, 6 daughters wrapped in wool blankets, and a crate of dry goods. Some people told him that his wife had died in Nebraska. Coughing up. He didn't say anything about her, not at all talked, but in just 2 years Tobias had grown that small wagon load into the biggest merchant business in the county. He bought land on the East Ridge, got exclusive contracts with the rail line, and built Whitmore Manor with stone from other countries and carved oak from St. Louis. Not only was there success, but there was also speed. Too quick and too good. Graybridge. I was taken in by progress and never questioned it until now. Sheriff Harlan found something strange when he looked through the town bank's records. For 6 months before the girl went missing, Tobias took out a lot of money in gold coins that were bigger than the store's sales. Indeed, they did much more than that. It was almost a perfect match between the deposits and the visits from the Eastern strangers. They were sent through wire transfers from accounts linked to a company in New York. The ledgers only had the initials of the name written, but they matched the embroidery on the napkin. UAC stands for the Union Atlantic Consortium. No one in town had ever done business with this group before, but it seems that Tobias Whitmore did. The pattern was found by Sheriff Harlan. Someone came to see me on the midnight train. The next evening, a wire was sent from the Whitmore estate. 3 days later, a big deposit showed up in Tobias's account. Then, another coin withdrawal. Say it again. But why? Graybridge didn't have any factories to invest in, mineral rights to sell, a patent, or a pipeline. The only thing they did have was a resource that no one dared talk about. Daughters of Tobias. The thing that scared Harlan the most was a drawer in the Whitmore study that was locked. One that not even Olive knew the key to. He broke it open with a warrant and the town's blacksmith. Inside were dozens of letters written by Tobias. They were all written in his hand, but none of them were addressed. They all started the same way, "To whom it may concern." I know for sure that what I'm writing, have done, can't be taken back. They weren't letters for work. They were confessions, letters he never sent, letters he never burned, letters written by a man drowning in something far worse than guilt. Need to do. Ruth Callahan got off the train with just one bag and tired eyes from seeing too much. Graybridge didn't expect her to be like that. She wore a long wool coat, dark boots that were dirty from Denver, and a leather folder that looked like it held a weapon. There was no bustle, lace gloves, or chaperone, since it did. She walked up to Sheriff Harland, introduced herself, and gave him her Department of Justice badge. She then asked for a room where she could talk to Tobias Whitmoor alone. "Is this really important?" he had asked Harlan. She said, "Because we're a small town. I'm here." Ruth Callahan had been following something for 6 years that most police wouldn't even call a network. It wasn't a gang or a syndicate. It was something older, smarter, and more modern. It was run by investment firms, charities, and frontier families can get help from foundations and placement services. It promised chances, an education in the city, respectable marriages, and jobs in Eastern industry, but only for daughters, always the smartest ones, the ones no one thought would go missing. They didn't just disappear either. They were taken, bought, and given new names. She had found signs of the same pattern in parts of Missouri, Colorado, Idaho, and now Graybridge. Too many times the name Union Atlantic Consortium had shown up for me to ignore it. So, when word of 6 missing sisters and a wealthy father whose money she couldn't explain got to her desk, she didn't wait for orders. She got on the following train. The whole thing, she said to Tobias, only took 28 minutes. When she came out of the Whitmoor library, her face was as cold as stone. She told Heron that he's not guilty, but he's also not the one running things. She pulled a letter out of Tobias's locked drawer and showed it to him. It was made 3 weeks before the person went missing. What they want is more than. I can give. I offered land, money, and power. They say that you can only get back the initial payment in full. I think they never wanted my help. It's just my kids. Ruth told them that Union Atlantic did more than just buy land. They paid for quiet. They made promises to guys who were in trouble. And when it was time to pick up, they gave us one last option. Follow through or lose everything. The money is people's lives. She gave Harlan a list. 24 other names, girls ages 14 to 23, missing from places just like Graybridge over the past decade. All had families who had recently gotten unexplained windfalls. All had visited by someone linked to Union Atlantic, and none had ever been seen again. "This isn't a case," Ruth said softly. "It's a pattern, and Graybridge," she warned, was just one thread in a tapestry of horror running coast to coast. It was a warehouse set for demolition, one of those long-forgotten buildings crouched in the industrial growth of Omaha's South End. Brick walls cracked from age windows closed for decades, ceiling sagging under the weight of rot and silence. But what the workers found behind a fake wall on the 3rd floor stopped the wrecking ball in its tracks. It was a room no one had entered for years, maybe longer. Inside filing cabinets, dozens, crates of personal belongings, boxes marked only with initials and numbers, photographs carefully preserved, journals, marriage certificates, lists, and dosses meticulously typed with handwritten notes. Each page cataloged the name of a young woman, her. Birthplace, education level, physical features, family standing, skills, temperament. But this was not charity, this was inventory. Among the files, 6 thin folders stacked together under the coded title WYGRWM01 through 06, Graybridge, Whitmoor. The pictures inside showed the sisters but older. Clara, perhaps in her 30s, her face serious, her hands folded in a pose too still for comfort. Nora in a fitted dress beside a painting that didn't look like her work. She was by herself in a place that looked like a train stop. Do not Bonnie. Laughing. Edith dressed up and standing next to a church organ. Oh, and Lillian. It was hard to tell who Lillian was, but something was missing from her eyes. The pictures were taken after 1903. Someone had written down where they were placed. The note said, "Asset acquired. Placement is guaranteed. Status checked." Ruth Callahan didn't say anything for almost an hour after walking into the room. "That's it," she spoke softly. "Downtown." The archive had records of hundreds of other people as well as the Whitmoor kids, Montana, Colorado, and Wyoming girls, Utah and California, girls no one could remember, girls whose names had been changed and whose families had been bribed, tricked, or hurt. It wasn't just a crime business, it was a store. And what happened was that young people obeyed and kept quiet. Ruth found a locked box in the very back of the room. She found something inside that took her breath away. 6 lockets, each with the letter C carved on it. Inside each one was a curl of hair, one last sign that they were theirs, not that they had died. The names in Tobias. There was no specific person who Whitmore's drawer were written to. He wrote them because he could no longer keep the truth from himself. Ruth Callahan found the rest correspondence stored with the Dosses in Omaha, a lot of written letters between Tobias and a Union Atlantic Consortium agent. The sender's name was only C.W., and he never signed his full name. His tone was always the same, though, cool, firm, and final. The first letter was written in 1897, just a year after Tobias moved to. Glen Bridge. We're glad you've become a part of the group. As planned, the land along the ridge was bought. Payment will be made to you in stages. For almost all of their time together, Tobias had worked with them. It started out as something small. In terms of land suggestions, shipping links, and introductions to civic leaders, there seems to be nothing illegal or even unethical going on. But as Graybridge grew, the group became more interested in it. They wanted power, attention, and quiet. And in return, they offered money, loans with no paperwork, on-time building, and contracts that no one else could get. All of this was done through fake companies that no one in town could track down. Even though Tobias did well, the letters changed tone every year. They began to look for suitable candidates. They wanted girls from good families with good morals and useful skills. Ideal age range, 14 to 22. At first, Tobias didn't answer. After that, he blocked. Then he said sorry. He gave more land and more people. He really tried hard to find someone else. Form of payment. But the group didn't give up and kept trying. By 1903, their demands were not just ideas. You're reminded of the basic deal. The return on spending must now be made sure of. There are 6 items that have been found. The arrangements will be made in private. We want you to work together. He had 6 valuable things. His girls. Tobias wrote his last letters by hand in frantic ink, but they were never sent or burned. You can't take them. I've given you everything. They are not money. I gave them hope. It was a nice world, I told them. Now I'll open the door, but I won't watch them go through it. In the living room of the Whitmoor Manor, Ruth read those words out loud to Sheriff Harlan. The wind outside shook the bare trees like cracked hands. After a long silence, Harlan asked, "Do you think he loved them?" Ruth closed the folder. "Yes," she replied. "That's what makes it worse." That Omaha room had names, but not the names of the people who lived there. Graybridge thought back. They were renamed, moved, erased, and given the name placements. One of them, Clara Whitmore, had been moved to Cleveland and given the name Mary Caldwell. She was married to a steel magnate who was almost twice her age, but only on paper. The file said she was picked because of how well she taught and how well she behaved. All 3 of her kids were told that their mother was an orphan from the East. Her husband told her not to write letters. Her diaries were taken away. Still, she hid scraps. Under the loose floors, she found tiny handwriting and letters she would never send. She died in 1921 from complications from pneumonia, but her journal was found in the Omaha room in a sealed envelope with the number 01 written on it. This was done according to policy, and there was no breach. One line was written over and over in the notebook. I remember the creek that was behind our house. I remember how October smelled. Nora Whitmoor was dropped off in Milwaukee. She changed her name to Helen Raines and married an art buyer who wouldn't let her. She should sign her own art. The file said she contributed to the aesthetic and was mentally compliant. She lived in a home that was full of her own art, but all of it was about her husband. There were landscapes with bleeding edges and pictures of women whose eyes were empty. Her neighbors said she didn't talk much. In 1925, she passed away. She only left behind a trunk full of unsigned paintings and one envelope written to Eel that was wrapped in a pressed maple leaf. The twin girls, Beatrice and Bonnie, were split on purpose. She was sent to Kansas with Beatrice. City married to a shipping trader who wanted a smart and flexible partner. From what the dossier said, she refused, argued, and fought. She was there for 14 months. Tuberculosis was written on the death record. The file said that the asset had ended too soon. Cause stress causes for non-compliance. She was sent to St. Louis under the name Miriam Dane and married to a banker who was very picky about details. She quietly did what she was told until she wasn't. She walked into the Missouri River in 1906. Her ring was found, but her body was never found. Found in a coat's breast pocket that had been folded up and left by the dock. There was a note inside that said, "Only, I miss the sound of 2 footsteps." Edith, who was a quiet person, was sent to Detroit to marry a preacher who needed a singing wife who liked helping people. The report said she was very flexible and would do well in public spiritual settings. She played the church organ at first. She was rarely seen in public after that. When she died in 1911, no obituary ran. Officially, no one called her family because she didn't have any. It was folded in thirds, and Ruth found it in the storage room. On the side, Edith had written, "God sees what the choir does not sing." The youngest, Lillian, was too young to be put right away. Until she turned 16, she was moved around between holding houses in Colorado Springs, Sacramento, and St. Paul. Her health was starting to get worse by that time. The file said that they were not fit for elite placement. Moved to an alternate site for maintenance. In 1909, she died. There is no burial site mentioned, no picture after 1903, just one more line in red ink. Asset retired, no sign in public. Ruth shook her hands as she closed the last folder. 6 girls, 6 broken lives that were put back together in ways they didn't want. Each used, thrown away, or forgotten, but not by the other. Because there was a page in the back of Clara's notebook that was hidden and almost missed. 6 letters that looked like petals on a flower. One word, home, in the middle. In the spring of 1924, the Chicago courtroom wasn't built for what was going on there. It was made for small crimes and legal cases. Disputes, the kind of meetings where someone paid a fine and shook hands. It turned out to be the site of one of the worst public trials in American history. In the news, it was called the Whitmoor trials. But that name wasn't right because there were more than 6 women. It was around 100. Federal officials charged 17 people with ties to the Union Atlantic based on evidence found in Omaha and the accounts of survivors that Ruth Callahan's team was able to track down. Group of 8. In the middle of it all was Clarence Worthing, who was once known as the gentleman builder in the East. There were bankers, judges, railroad men, social reformers, and more. He wore white gloves, a tailored gray suit, and a gold watch on a chain around his neck when he walked into court. He smiled and said, "Often." When asked if he knew the Whitmoor girls' names, he said, "I know investments when I see them." When shown pictures of Nora's unsigned. When asked about Clara's journal, he said, "What she chose to write was her own indulgence. It was not part of our system." He didn't flinch when the names of over 200 missing girls were read out loud, or when a mother from Colorado collapsed on the witness stand. He didn't even raise an eyebrow when survivors testified, their voices shaking as they talked about being robbed of their names, their pasts, and their futures. Worthing never felt bad about what he did because to him it was just business. He said the girls were saved from tragedy and put in comfort with a purpose. He used words like efficiency, stability, and mutual benefit. When asked what he would say to the families, he said, "You'd be surprised how many of them thanked us in the end." The silence that followed those words was colder than a winter wind. The trial lasted 19 weeks, and 15 of the 17 defendants were found guilty on all charges, including conspiracy, fraud, kidnapping, and illegally transporting people across state lines. Clarence Worthing was given a life sentence without the possibility of parole. But some people got away, and others who were too powerful or well-connected were never charged. Evidence and witnesses disappeared, and names were changed. But the trial changed everything. It brought trafficking into the light, forced newspapers to print what they had been hiding, and made congressmen talk about the names of girls they had been ignoring. Evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a waistcoat and a handshake. When the trial was over, reporters swarmed Ruth Callahan with one burning question. Would the Whitmoor sisters testify? Only 3 had survived: Clara, Nora, and Elizabeth, formerly known as Bonnie. The others were names on tombstones, or worse, had never even been given that. Ruth reached out to them quietly and politely. She knew what she was asking. To come forward was not just to speak, it was to undo, to destroy the lives they had spent 2 decades stitching together. Clara, living under the name Mary Caldwell, now 47 years old, was the only one who said yes. She traveled to Chicago alone, sat before the committee, looked the men in the eye, and told them everything. Her voice did not tremble. She spoke of the day her father kissed her forehead for the last time, of the train ride with no destination, of waking in a strange house where nothing was hers, of 3 children who called her mama, but never. She talked about being held captive and the eraser of self, how silence becomes a language and how every kindness feels like a leash. She ended with a single sentence. We were not lucky girls who found wealthy husbands. We were stolen pages in someone else's ledger. Nora chose not to testify because she was now living as Helen Raines and had her own children in a quiet studio. She told Ruth in a letter, "If I speak, I lose them, and I've already lost too much." But inside the envelope was a small square of canvas with 6 women holding hands in a garden of bare trees. The women didn't have faces, but they were holding hands. Elizabeth Bonnie also said no. She had changed her name again after her sister died. She lived alone, worked as a bookkeeper, and didn't have any family. Ruth met her once in a small cafe outside of St. Louis. Elizabeth didn't say anything for the first 10 minutes, finally said in a whisper, "It wasn't what they did that was the worst part. Know that they never thought they had to hide it." Before she left, she gave Ruth a piece of paper that said, "Tell them we survived." It wasn't signed, so Clara was the only one at the microphone. Behind her were the others, quiet, tired, and the ones who put a light in a window and waited for no one to come. And in that courtroom, with flashbulbs going off and ink drying on columns across the room. In the country, they weren't just looking for missing girls, they were witnesses. By the summer of 1925, Graybridge didn't call the manor Whitmoor. It had been empty for almost 20 years, with vines growing up its walls and windows broken by wind and time. Kids would dare each other to touch the rusted gate and run away. No one wanted to buy it or live next to it, so the town tore it down quietly, like dust being brushed off of an old coat. Its land was left empty, and not even grass grew there for a long time. The mercantile was sold to someone from out of state. Edith's hymn numbers were painted over in the church. The twins' dress shop was turned into a storage shed. Clara's school was given a new name. People talked less about the Whitmore girls, but they were still remembered. In 1926, a small monument was built on the edge of town at the exact spot where the girls had last been. Seen were 6 bronze silhouettes with initials carved into the base instead of faces or names. Below them was a message for the daughters who had disappeared and the silence that let them go. Ruth retired 2 years later and never got married or wrote a book. She moved to a small cottage outside of Helena and took care of a garden that always had 6 rose bushes. Every fall, she got letters from unknown people with no return address and a dried maple leaf inside each one. What happened to the Whitmore sisters wasn't the only one. The Union Atlantic Consortium had inspired other groups with different names, cities, and ledgers. And even though laws changed and people became more aware, the truth stayed the same. Where there is need, there will always be men who see opportunity. When there is silence, there are always people who want to hurt you. But when there is remembering, there is still resistance.